Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Paige McAllister, and I'm a member of the RelEvate team and the organizer of the RelTalks series. I am so excited that you're all here today and very excited for our presentation. RelEvate, if you don't know who we are, if this is the first time you're hearing that word, we're a multidisciplinary team of scholars and practitioners who are working to increase access to research-backed relationship information. So this presentation series is just a part of that overall mission to highlight graduate students and the work that they're doing. Let me pull up my bio for Lorin. Lorin, our presenter tonight, is a third-year PhD student in the Couple and Family Therapy program at Kansas State University. Lorin is a licensed therapist and AAMFT approved supervisor in training with a private practice in Manhattan, Kansas, where she specializes in seeing clients with marginalized identities. Lorin is the recent winner of the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapists 2020 Emerging Leader Award for her work in her community by creating a pro bono therapy practice where she sees women who are in the process or have recently fled an abusive relationship. At this site, she supervises master's level clinicians and provides supervision to aid in their understanding and competency working with this unique population. Lorin is also a two-time recipient of the AAMFT Minority Fellowship, where her main focus is to expand the delivery of culturally competent mental health and substance abuse services to underserved minority populations. Lorin's research interests include social justice, intimate partner violence, and Black feminism. Her work as a Black feminist led her to create a theory called toxic Black femininity, which examines the internalized and dominant message that as a Black woman, one must be rigidly strong, hypersexual, and a primary caregiver to all before acknowledging or taking care of one's own needs and desires. In her spare time, she loves cuddling with her two fur babies, listening to audiobooks, and spending time with her partner and their family friends. I will turn the time over to Lorin. And any questions, there will be time at the end of the presentation for questions. Feel free to put them in the chat. I will be paying attention to them. Lorin, you can ignore the chat. I will take care of that for you. But we'll answer questions at the end of the presentation.
Hi, I'm Lorin. Thank you all for coming. It's really excited to get the chance to talk with you all about something that I'm super passionate about, and especially now with things going on in this country, I feel like is even more relevant than it already has been. So I want to just kind of start by once acknowledging that I'm a Black woman. So this topic is extremely personal to me. Therefore, I'm extremely passionate about it. So hopefully my excitement and passion doesn't come out too much and you can still flow with me. I learned how to speak in New York, so I say I talk really fast, sometimes in cursive. So if you're like, what did she say? Ask Paige to tell me to slow down, and I will, and I'd be more than willing to send the slideshow out to you or talk more after I'm done. So you have numerous options to get off this material. So these are some of the intended takeaways that I hope that after the half hour we spend together, you can say, this is worth my time, and these are the things I've learned from this presentation. So mainly, I think the question that's on a lot of people's minds is, how can I become a better advocate for people of color? What can I do? And so obviously this is 30 minutes, so I'm going to try my best to give you some starting points. This is a starting point. This is not going to take you all the way. This is a conversation starter. The second is how to know the difference between being not racist versus being anti-racist. Anti-racism is something that's been talked about more in today's society, and so kind of to understand the nuances of both and how to embody both, and to once again start the process of becoming more anti-racist. So because we're talking about these topics, you might get uncomfortable, and that's okay. And so instead of shying away from that uncomfortableness, obviously I'm a therapist, so I'm going to lean into discomfort and anxiety. Process with yourself. What's going on? What am I feeling? What am I thinking? Why am I feeling these things? Why might I be feeling triggered or uncomfortable? And where do these messages come from? So I hope that you can engage. Please, if you have questions, put them in the chat. I am 100% game to answer anything. So I know you don't know me, but I want this to be as safe a space as possible to answer and talk about some sometimes difficult topics and conversations. So we're going to start off the back with slavery. So slavery in this country, it's huge, especially for Black people and people of color. It's not just Black people that were impacted by slavery. However, in the U.S., we think of race as very binary. So it's either you're white or you're Black. And in the middle, well, sometimes you figure out where you fit in. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to talk about race as a very binary experience, while also holding space that it's not a binary experience. It's very nuanced. Slavery started in the 1600s and lasted until 1863, where it was banned through the Emancipation Proclamation. So then it was officially abolished in 1865 through the 13th Amendment. So what that amendment said was that you could not own slaves. Black people of color had to be free. So directly after that, in 1865, was the Jim Crow era, and that lasted from 1865 to 1964. So, question. Lorin, slavery ended so long ago. It did not end so long ago. Slavery in its most heinous form, right? And I use the word heinous lightly because truly all of it's heinous, but however, that's not who I am. So, 56 years ago, when we talk about slavery, the ramifications of slavery ended 56 years ago. When you say slavery ended so long ago, what you're really talking about is chattel slavery. And chattel slavery was people being shipped in boats, people being stolen, people being mass genocides, people being locked in chains, beaten, whipped. That's what people are talking about. So this is a timeline to kind of put it in perspective. This was in 2015, so obviously add 5 more years to that for it to be 2020. But the red was active chattel slavery. The blue is segregation, and that's that Jim Crow period where there was white entrances, Black entrances, and it was very overt that if you're a person of color, you are not wanted in society. So we have here, so white people only entrances, or people of color, or colored entrances. That picture represents chattel slavery. That's what we're talking about when we think of these things. And so this picture at the bottom of a boat, that's actually a slave ship, and it shows you how slaves were packed into these ships, treated as animals. That's what we're talking about when we say slavery ended long ago. So I would make a huge assumption, I could be wrong, but that many of us know people who are over the age of 56. So if you know someone over the age of 56, then if they're 56 today, that meant that they were born when the Civil Rights Act was enacted. If you know someone who was born before that, then they were born during segregation times. So what do all these people have in common? All these people were born in 1960. 5 years before the Civil Rights Act was passed. So often when we think of slavery, when we think of civil rights, we see these black and white pictures. But these are people that we see on TV today. These are people that we still actively engage. I know I'm a huge Scandal fan, so Fitz, I mean, come on. Watching it the other day. Also interesting, our 2 presidential Republican and Democratic nominees were born way before 1965. So Trump was 19 years old and Biden was 23 when the Civil Rights Act was passed. So once again, slavery was not that long ago. The ramifications, the ideologies, the beliefs are still so deeply ingrained to our country that it's not this thing that we can truly separate ourselves from. So systemic racism. What is systemic racism? Systemic racism is racism that's so ingrained into our society, it's seen as almost natural or normal. It's this notion that, once again, it's the notion that slavery ended so long ago. That's systemic racism. It's the notion that, I know in my textbooks growing up, all these pictures that I saw of Martin Luther King Jr., of slavery, were all in black and white, right? So that allows me to distance myself from it. When in actuality, there's pictures in color. There was color pillows back then, but that's not the image we see because it's so ingrained into our psyche, which means that it takes active work to fight against these things that are so ingrained into our system. We can't just say, oh, I'm not a racist, because it's truly ingrained into our society. So it's cognitive work, it's thinking about it, it's acting, it's working to be different than what has been the norm. So how can you spot systemic racism in the communities that you live in? So one thing is majority or all white leadership, because that's not encompassing all the diversity that's actually in this country and in the world. Lack of racial diversity in hiring, despite lack of qualified applicants of color. That could look like having to put your race on applications. Why does it matter a person's race if you can work said job or you have the qualifications or credentials for said employment? The number of people in color, especially Black men in prisons. So there's a documentary on Netflix called The 13th Amendment, or 13th. I can't remember one of the two. If you haven't watched it, I strongly suggest you do. It talks about our judicial system and how the incarceration rate for people of color is drastically disproportionate to the amount of people of color that are actually residing in this country. And also prison sentences. Prison sentences on average tend to be more severe for people of color, especially Black men, than any other demographic, but especially to white people. People of color are also more likely to be racially profiled as dangerous or deviant in society and also in media. So think about some of the movies you see, think of some of the TV shows you watch. People of color, are they being depicted as the villains, as the bad guys, as the hard, aggressive gangsters, thugs? When I say those words, who comes to mind, right? People of color are also more likely to have their neighborhoods deemed as ghettos, as impoverished, while white neighborhoods are seen to be more privileged. They have better schooling, they have more tax dollars, they're seen as more geared. And Black Americans are also discriminated in healthcare settings. More Black women die in childbirth in the first world country than any other racial group. And that's a very interesting dynamic, right? And it's because especially Black people, but racial groups are also often seen as more resilient. So if they're more resilient, that means they can withstand more. If you can withstand more, you're less likely to receive competent care. And police brutality emerge of unarmed Black and brown people are at a higher rate than they are for white people. Not saying that these things don't exist for white people. When you look at overall facts, it's disproportionate. So anti-racism. Not being racist is saying that I do not intentionally go out of my way to harm or discriminate or oppress a person of color. So for instance, you might say, I would never treat a person of color differently because of their skin. Great. Anti-racist is a little bit different. It's overt actions. It's intentionality. How can I use the privileges I have? And it's one thing I talk about a lot with my students and my colleagues is that privilege is not bad. Everyone wants privilege. Everyone has privilege. But it's how you use your privilege. It's how you hold on to your privilege. That's what matters. So being privileged is being of majority or dominant religions. Being privileged could look like having higher income, higher levels of education. Being privileged can be having white or whiter looking skin. So using your privilege to advance and advocate for marginalized groups, that's being anti-racist. It's what am I doing to support my peers, my friends, my community of color. So how can I become anti-racist? This is a beginning step. So I don't want this to be where you stop with your knowledge. I want this to continue. So the first thing is to check your own biases and where they come from. We all have biases. I'm a therapist and I have biases, right? So it's not to shame ourselves. It's not to say like, oh, I'm above this, because we're not. It's a part of our culture. Like I said, systemic racism is a thing. So how can I, one, become aware and in tune with myself to figure out what is it that I'm struggling with, and then what work can I do? I struggle when people say that they're experts at social justice, because I don't think that's a thing. It's something that I'm constantly working at. I'm going to get things wrong. And when I get things wrong, I don't sit there in my shame and it's like, crap, I messed up. What can I do? I actively work. How can I become better? What can I do to learn more? How can I prevent this from happening again? Or try my best not to. Doesn't mean I'm perfect. So that goes into educating yourself. So if you have the opportunity, diversity trainings. I was talking to someone earlier who had the option to take a rock and roll course or an option to take an American Ethnic Studies course, and this person chose the American Ethnic Studies choice. Expand your horizons, educate yourself, do things that make you uncomfortable. Obviously, make sure you're safe, but do things that challenge yourself. I truly believe that sometimes a little bit of anxiety can create change. So how can we do that for ourselves? I think it's also important that the people of color in your lives are not responsible for your education, unless they choose to be. So if I'm in your life and I'm doing a presentation about anti-racism, you ask me a question, well then yes, we can have that conversation. But if I'm eating my sandwich, minding my business, that may not be the best time to ask me, Lorin, what are your thoughts on black people? Like, one, I don't know all black people, and two, that's not what I'm here for. So really being mindful and aware that you're not asking people of color to take on more of an emotional toll to help you in your growth, and also to sometimes to soothe your own anxiety about things that you might be struggling with yourself. I said this again, I will say this all the time, but use your privileged identities for the advancement of people of color. I use my privileged identity as a person who's getting a PhD, as someone who's educated, to talk to my colleagues, to talk to my peers, to make myself uncomfortable, to put myself out there, to be vulnerable, in hopes that conversations like this will pay it forward, and that you all in this presentation will go through and talk to the people in your lives. And hopefully, with all of us, we can make our mark and help to make people become more accountable and also more aware. And to highlight people in your lives and communities when they're failing or when they're not doing the right thing, or when they may be having biases that may not be aware of. It's super awkward. I'm not gonna lie. I'm like, so easy. It's not. So it's something that is gonna have to take practice, but you also can't practice if you don't try. And so it doesn't have to look perfect. It doesn't have to happen as aggressively as you want it to be, but even just highlighting those moments of, hey, what did you mean by that statement? Or can you say more? Or why is that the assumption? Something that simple, something that subtle can be the beginning part to start those conversations. And so I truly acknowledge that this work is uncomfortable and it will require vulnerability and honestly uncomfortability. But in order to truly be anti-racist, you cannot be silent. You cannot be complacent when injustices are happening every day around you and in our communities. This is active work, and it's intentional work to support communities. It's exhausting, and as a person of color, I tell you, it's exhausting living in a system that does not see me. It's exhausting living in a system that treats me differently without even knowing me. It's exhausting having to actively challenge, actively try to overcompensate for stereotypes that have nothing to do with me and yet can hold me back, can harm me in any way. So hold space for yourself, have compassion for yourself, have compassion for your community. It's not to chastise anyone, it's not to say I'm better than or less than. It's how can we encourage growth? How can we encourage change? I truly believe that it's compassion. People don't grow and change when they're being threatened. People grow and change when they feel compassion, when they feel empathy. We're all starting out somewhere. That's where you want to start with your own journey. So I said a lot, and I want to leave room for questions. So if you have questions, please unmute yourself. I don't know, Paige. I can't see anyone. So Paige, if someone puts something in the chat, please let me know. And here's my email address. You can feel free to email me. You can ask for the slideshow. You can ask for other slideshows. I don't know, whatever you want.
Thank you so much, Lorin. That was amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll leave it open for a little bit if anybody wants to put a question in the chat or We're a small group. You can unmute yourself if you want to. And Lauren, I'll let you know. I'll let you choose if you want to keep sharing your screen or not.
Oh, I guess not. Okay.
Hey friends, I have a question. It's Shaylin.
Shaylin.
So, as I think a lot of us here are members of AMFT, and a big piece of AMFT and what they seem to be hoping for is cultural competence. And you touched on that earlier on how you don't really think it's a thing, right? Because competence implies an ending point when there isn't one. So where do you see us going, like as far as like changing some of the language around that, or how do you think we can try and start changing some of the language around that so that I don't want to say it makes more sense, but like actually describes what we're trying to do?
Yeah, so for those of you that don't know what double AMFT is, it's the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapists. So for those of us who are therapists, that's our governing body. And so I think with any system, I think everyone wants to be socially just. Everyone wants to say like, yes, we did it. Here's our stamp, A+ for us. And I think that's great. I think, and obviously it's my opinion, I'm not speaking on behalf of anyone else, but I truly think that it's vulnerability and the anxiety of feeling like I haven't done enough. And so once again, like I said, I feel like if compassion was brought into these conversations, we could learn to talk more about the things that we don't do right, the things that we mess up, right? So because I'm a therapist, because I'm the one presenting, I have a lot of space to be vulnerable and say like, I mess up. But this probably would look a little different if I was in a room full of professors and governing bodies, and I'm like, yeah, I messed up. Like it's that vulnerability piece, it's that power piece. And so unfortunately and fortunately, I think people in positions of power, it's their work to make spaces more accommodating to allow those changes to happen. I think it's also people knowing better to have those conversations to happen. I think up until probably very recently, the narrative has been we need to master these things as we master everything else in life. In education, the goal is to master, to be the best, to understand, to have complete competency. And so having vulnerability to know that you will never have the competency, and also the pressure that you have to keep learning. I think that's where that can change.
Thanks, friend. This was great.
Thank you. If you want to send me in the chat privately, you can. I can read it out. The talker, so. Amanda, what advice would you give to business organizations? Hold on, the whole thing. What advice would you give to businesses or organizations who want to address racial equity in their businesses? So yeah, so in working in businesses, once again, people were. So it's bringing in speakers, bringing in people who are knowledgeable, right? I struggle with the word expert, but more knowledgeable, I can sleep well at night saying that one. So people who are more knowledgeable about these things, and creating a culture, creating a workspace where it's okay to have conversations. It's not okay to be disrespectful. And I think that's a very fine line. And so however your business runs or whatever you want to incorporate in that business and how you want to have these conversations, but laying the groundwork that it's okay to be vulnerable. And I struggle with this because vulnerability takes courage, courage takes safety, and safety takes trust, right? So you have to work backwards in that. So how can you create an office environment that, one, you can trust each other? Then when trusting each other, how can you create brave spaces where people can be vulnerable in those brave spaces and talk about things? And also being mindful that diversity trainings, diversity education should not fall on people of color to do that. That's an additional role that, unless they're being compensated for, that's additional role that they're being asked to do that other colleagues, other people, and that's with any marginalization, aren't being asked to do. So I'm a firm believer of too, paying people for their time, people for their expertise, and paying people for their voices. Hope that answered your question. So do you have any suggestions for therapists encountering racism in the therapy room? Yes, I do. So I think in therapy it's a little bit different because while you have power, the ultimate goal is, well, I guess depending on the theory you're using, is how can you become kind of lessen that power and become more people. I don't know how you would say that. So I think one, if it's I'm a firm believer of protecting yourself. So if you're feeling uncomfortable in your therapy space, if you're feeling that this is something that you can't work with this person, I'm a strong believer of referring that person to someone else. I'm also a strong believer, though, with my personality, of having these conversations of what do you mean by that. So I'm going to make something up. If a client was saying like, oh, you're really oh, I hate this one, oh, you're really articulate, so like, what does it mean that I'm articulate? Describe that to me, right? Because I truly believe for most people, they try to do the best they can. And so sometimes that's not even being aware of their own biases. Sometimes that's not being aware of, oh, well, you talk like you're white. Like, to them, that's truly a compliment, but to me, it's highly offensive, right? And so having those conversations, when you feel like that person is not reciprocating that, you feel like you're still not safe, then protect yourself. But some people may disagree with me. Okay, so when people feel compelled to teach their white counterparts, how do we handle that burden to educate? I feel it often and feel stuck. I don't want for someone to continue on in ignorance, but I also don't want to speak for my whole community. Yeah, so that's really difficult. I love giving people links like, oh, you want to learn more about this? Here's a book, here's a video, here's those people, here's a chat, right? And it sounds like too, if you're in these spaces, if you want to take on that burden, you can. It can be talking with the leadership in the, I think you said school, educate, so I'm going to say school. If you have a program director, if you have someone that's in charge, talking about how can we bring these things in, how can we bring voices in, how can we bring some education into our syllabi, into our spaces. Every university has a diversity statement. So if they really mean that diversity statement, what can you do to uphold that? What can you do to make that apparent? Because I'm almost positive that's like a mandate at this point. So if we're talking about this class will be equitable, if we're talking about this class can be safe, if we're talking about this university values X, Y, and Z, how are you bringing this up? Because as a person of color, as a person of whatever your identity may be, this is how I'm feeling. And if that doesn't work, well, then there's options you can go to make your space feel safer. And if it's in a school, you might have diversity or equity officers, you might have student life that you can go to. But once again, accountability. It's one thing to say you're going to do something. Accountability is a piece that gets things moving, gets things done.
Thank you so much, Lorin, and thank you everyone for your great questions. We can't give you a thunderous applause in person, but a big virtual applause. Zoom is so awkward for that, but that's where we're at. So yes, thank you, Lorin, and thank you all for being here with us today. I do want to remind you that the RelTalks series is 5 weeks long, so we have 4 more presentations. Next week is actually my presentation, so you want to see me talk about how do we incorporate self-compassion in our lives, particularly with the challenges of this year. You can come next week. And I also have created a feedback survey. It is so short. It is 3 questions, but watch for that with the same email that you registered. And we really appreciate it if you would fill that out. And I think that's it. So thank you, everyone.